Hey everybody! Last week we learned about Moses when he was a baby and his mom had to float him down the river in order to protect him. And we learned that God protects us and is always with us. Today we're going to talk about when Moses grew up. What did he do? So we're going to make our own burning bush, which is how God talked to Moses. So go ahead and listen to the story about when Moses grew up. Moses grew up in the royal palace. As Pharaoh's grandson, he wore the finest clothes, ate the best food, and learned from the smartest teachers. Servants bowed down to him, and Egyptian men were afraid of him. Life was more fun in the palace than it would have been as a Hebrew slave. One day when Moses grew up, he discovered that he was a Hebrew. He set off to visit his real family. While he watched them making mud bricks, he saw an Egyptian man beating a Hebrew slave. Moses' heart was filled with anger. "How dare you hit that slave?" he shouted. Moses killed the Egyptian and buried his body in the sand. The next day, Moses went out and saw two Hebrew men fighting each other. "Why are you hitting your friend?" he asked one of the men. "Who are you to tell me what to do?" the man answered. "Will you kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" Moses' heart pounded with fear. Who else knew he had killed an Egyptian? Moses sat on the edge of the wall in Midian, staring grimly into the distance. "I'm in big trouble," he thought. "There is no way I can ever go back to Egypt." Just then, the 7 daughters of Jethro, the Midianite priest, came to fetch water for their father's sheep. A gang of shepherds tried to scare them, but Moses leapt up and chased them away. When Jethro heard how Moses had protected his daughters, he invited Moses to come and eat with them. "Moses, you have done a great thing for this family," he said. "I will give you my eldest daughter, Zipporah, to marry." Zipporah's sisters clapped their hands. They were happy their sister was getting married. They gathered together and prepared for the wedding. That week the village buzzed with excitement. Zipporah was getting married. Jethro invited all his family and neighbors and friends to the wedding ceremony. Everyone sang and danced and had a party that lasted many days and many nights. And from that time on, Moses and Zipporah lived together with Jethro's family. Every morning, Moses took Jethro's sheep and goats into the wilderness to graze. This wasn't the life that Moses had planned, but 40 years in the desert gave him lots of time to spend with God. He had grown up like a prince in Pharaoh's palace, and now he was a shepherd in the desert. "I live in the middle of nowhere," thought Moses. "What is God up to?" Back in Egypt, things were getting worse for the Hebrew people. But God hadn't forgotten his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He saw how hard the Hebrews worked, and he knew just what to do to set them free. One day, Moses noticed a bush that was on fire, yet it was not burning up. "That's pretty strange," said Moses. "I better take a closer look." To his surprise, God spoke to him out of the bush. "Moses, do not come any closer. You are standing on holy ground. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Moses' knees began to tremble. He tore off his sandals and covered his face with his hands. God continued, "I've seen how badly my people are being treated in Egypt. Go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go." Moses wasn't sure if he liked that idea very much. "Why are you sending me?" he asked. He peeped through his fingers at the burning bush. "I'm nobody and a wanted man. Pharaoh won't believe a word that I say." "Listen to me," said God. "You have nothing to fear. I'm going to punish the Egyptians, but I will protect my people. When you've led them out of Egypt, come back and worship me here on this mountain." So that people would believe Moses, God showed him how to do signs and wonders. "What is that in your hand?" asked God. "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw his wooden staff on the ground, and it turned into a snake. His eyes popped out of his head. He gazed at the wooden staff in amazement. But Moses was still worried. "I'm a terrible speaker," he said. "Can't you send someone else?" God became angry with Moses. "Don't you have a brother, Aaron? He talks a lot. I will send him with you. He can speak for you, and you can speak for me." Moses sighed and scratched his beard. There was no getting out of the job that God had given him. Moses and his family set out for Egypt. Soon Moses' brother Aaron came running out to meet them. God had instructed him to join Moses in the desert. Moses told Aaron everything God had said, and showed him the signs that he had been commanded to perform. Aaron stared at the staff in disbelief. He could hardly believe his eyes. After a few months of traveling through the desert, the two brothers finally arrived in Egypt. Aaron spoke to the Hebrew leaders, and Moses performed the signs for everyone to see. The Hebrews stamped their feet and danced for joy. The next day Moses and Aaron took the wooden staff and marched up the steps to Pharaoh's palace. Moses wanted Pharaoh to understand God's message, so he let Aaron do all the talking. Aaron took a deep breath and bowed before Pharaoh. God wants you to let his people go so they can learn his ways and worship him. But God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he became very stubborn. Who is this God of the Hebrews? I don't know him, and I'm not letting anyone go. I need them to work for me. Pharaoh spoke to his slave masters. Don't give the lazy Hebrews any straw, he told them. They can get it themselves. But they must still make the same number of bricks as before. The Hebrew slaves became angry with Moses. They gathered around him, shaking their fists. Thanks to you, Pharaoh is working us harder. You've made our lives worse. Moses sighed and stared at the sky. God, why have you sent me? He asked. Pharaoh's only making things worse. You haven't helped your people at all. Wait and see, said God. By the time I have finished with him, Pharaoh will be glad to see my people leave. Now go and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Aaron and Moses stood before Pharaoh again and told him what God had said. Pharaoh covered his ears and laughed, so Aaron raised the staff and turned the water in the Nile to blood. All the fish died, and the Egyptians could not drink water from the river. Pharaoh was not impressed. My magicians can do the same thing, he said. He summoned the magicians, and they turned the water at the palace into blood. They couldn't match what God had done, but it was good enough for Pharaoh. Then God called millions of frogs to hop out of the river. They jumped through people's houses and crept under their bed, and boy did they stink! The Egyptian magicians also made the frogs appear, but they couldn't make them go away. Moses, make those frogs disappear, cried Pharaoh. If you do, I'll let your people go. But when the frogs were all dead, Pharaoh changed his mind. The slaves must stay in Egypt. Life was tough for the Egyptians, but Pharaoh's heart remained hard. So God said to Moses, tell Aaron to strike the dust on the ground with the staff, and I will change the dust to lice. Aaron struck the ground, and lice crawled all across the land of Egypt. Pharaoh couldn't stop scratching his head. Those lice were itchy. The Egyptian magicians tried to use their magic to make the lice appear, but they could not do the same thing. The Hebrew God must have done this, they told Pharaoh. But Pharaoh did not listen, and he didn't let the Hebrews go. Next, God sent a swarm of flies over the land, except where the Hebrews lived. The flies buzzed through the palace and around Pharaoh's head. The Egyptians tried to run away from the flies, but the flies chased them everywhere, and they couldn't escape. Life was not fun for the people in the land of Egypt. Pharaoh was still stubborn and proud. He refused to let the Hebrews go. So God sent a plague upon the animals of Egypt. When the Egyptians woke up the next morning, their donkeys and cattle lay dead on the ground. How dare none of the Hebrew animals die, thundered Pharaoh. Then God said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of ash from a fireplace and throw them in the air before Pharaoh. Moses did what God asked, and boils appeared on every Egyptian and animal in Egypt. It drove them crazy. Pharaoh's magicians couldn't even stand up because they were covered in these nasty boils, just like the other Egyptians. They grit their teeth and scratched their legs. Why can't our gods help us? God promised his people, and none of the Hebrews were covered in boils. Life became harder and harder for the Egyptians. Next, God sent a huge fiery hailstorm. Lightning flashed back and forth, and thunder rumbled through the sky. Hailstones the size of rocks rained down, and fire from the hail ran along the ground. The hail didn't destroy anything where the Hebrews lived. It was the strangest hailstorm the Egyptians had ever seen. Pharaoh clasped his head in his hands and moaned, make it stop, and I'll let the Hebrew people go. But after the hail thundered and stopped, Pharaoh changed his mind. His heart was still hard, and he didn't let the Hebrews go. Pharaoh's servants begged him to change his mind. "We can't stand these plagues. Can't you see that Egypt is being destroyed? Why won't you let them go and worship their God?" Pharaoh thought about it, and he tried to make a deal with Moses. "Go worship your God, but only take the men." Moses sighed and shook his head. This is not what God wanted. Moses knew it wouldn't be long before God sent another plague. Sure enough, God sent a strong wind that blew all day and night. The next morning, the wind brought a swarm of locusts. The locusts flew through Egypt, gobbling all the vegetables and trees and even the grass. The greedy locusts ate everything. Then Moses reached out his hand, and Egypt turned dark for 3 days. People couldn't leave their houses because of the darkness. It was black as midnight. But the Hebrews had a light. Even after all this, Pharaoh still did not let the people go. God had had enough of Pharaoh's stubborn behavior. He said to Moses, "I will bring one last plague. At midnight I will kill all the firstborn children and animals of Egypt. No one will escape. But if the Hebrew people do what I say, I will spare them. After this, Pharaoh will let them go." That night God commanded a sign made from blood of a lamb to be put on the sides of the door and over the doorposts of the Hebrews' homes. Just before midnight, a mist crept through the homes of the Egyptians. Every firstborn male died, just as God had warned. But the lamb's blood protected the Hebrews who had listened to God's instruction. Pharaoh was a broken man. He called Moses and Aaron before him. "Get out here and take the Hebrew people with you. Make sure they take all their belongings. I never want to see them again." Moses and Aaron led the people out of Egypt. The people sang as they left, "God has delivered us from Pharaoh. Finally, we are free." So that's one of my favorite Bible stories. So God really did help the people of Israel get out of Egypt, didn't he? He sent how many plagues? Were you counting? He sent 10 plagues. The plagues were all really different, but none of them were good, right? They were all pretty bad. None of them were very good for the Egyptians. But how did Moses talk to God originally? God talked through a burning bush. So that's what we're going to make today. But what did we learn from this story? We learned that God protects us. God is going to always protect the people who believe in him. Whether we feel like he's protecting us or not, he always is protecting us. And that's important to remember as we go throughout our lives. As long as we're faithful to God, he will protect us. You don't really need very much for this craft. You need 4 sheets of paper, some crayons, and a pair of scissors, and some glue and some tape. So on your first piece of paper, I want you to draw a bush. It can be a really simple bush. Now I'm just going to color mine in green. On your other 2 sheets of paper, I would like you to trace your hand 4 times. So here's my first hand. And here's my second hand. And then I'm going to do the same thing on my other sheet of paper, so I have 4 hands. Once you've traced your hand 4 times, then cut out all 4 of your hands. Then once you've done that, color your hands red, yellow, and orange. So here are my hands all colored in. I colored each finger a different shade of red, yellow, or orange. You can do whatever you want. But now what do my hands look like? They look like flames. So we're going to take our bush, and then we're going to attach our hand flames, either using tape or glue, to our bush. And I'm going to overlap our hands. I want to make sure my whole bush is covered in flames, because wasn't the bush all covered in flames when God talked to Moses? So here are all of my flames that are going on my green bush. I'm going to take this one up here a little higher. So the cool thing about why they're hands is then we can bend them. So the flames are now sticking up out of our bush. So I'm going to go bend all of my fingers. And then it really looks like my bush is on fire, doesn't it? There's a little better angle. So that's my flaming bush. So the last thing I want you to add to your bush is a Bible verse. I want you to add, I will certainly be with you. And that's Exodus 3:12. So God was with Moses the whole time he was leading the people of Israel out of Egypt. And that's very important for us to remember. God is with us and God is protecting us. So that's it for us this week. I hope you had fun and I hope I see you in Sunday school on Sunday. Bye!